So welcome. This is Driving Learning Culture Virtually. Really appreciate you attending this session with us. Nicole and we work for a company called the McChrystal Group. It's a consultancy based just outside Washington, D.C. And what we do is we unleash the power of teams. And so we do a lot of leader development work, a lot of training work with executives, first-time managers, and colleagues across sectors. So we're really excited to be with you all to kind of talk about some of the work that we do, especially within a virtual environment, to drive inclusive approaches. So for our introductions, I'm going to introduce Nicole, and then she'll introduce me. So Nicole Lefort is a learning designer at the McChrystal Group with me. She has a background in sociology and worked in a trade association as a designer and a learning management specialist. So has really that design and technology intersection. And additionally, she does some incredible work on psychological safety and trust that she incorporates into her design practice.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessie. I'm going to introduce Jessie. Jessie is a learning designer with me at McChrystal Group, and her background is actually in both business and learning design. So she has an MBA as well as a master's in learning design, and she did a lot of work for the George Washington University in DC doing instructional design, working with administrators, working with facilitators and teachers, many like you, I'm sure, in the room here. And one of the reasons why, I'll take a step back and talk a bit meta for a second, we decided to introduce each other is it's a practice that we use at McChrystal Group for learners to make sure that they have that initial engagement with each other. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about through the session today, and hopefully engaging with you all on, especially since it's a little bit more classroom style, we have the luxury of being able to engage with you a bit more than a big session, is talking about how we can actually drive this engagement and inclusion in the virtual setting. Obviously, we're in person here today, but many of the principles that we know and love in the in-person setting can still apply in the virtual setting. We just have to be super intentional about it. So that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. Again, a little bit meta. We'll kind of explain some of why we're doing what we're doing as we're doing it to kind of give some of that learning principle design.
Great, thank you. So first today we're going to talk about, what is a learning culture? What do we mean by that and why it's important? And within the roles that we play, not only is it important in that virtual classroom in which we're training leaders, but we're also empowering them to apply those practices when they go back and they work with their teams or when they speak up with their own leadership. So it really is a full cycle that what we create in this virtual space will be translated into how these leaders continue working in these hybrid, remote, distributed environments. We're going to provide some guiding principles for creating psychological safety and trust in the virtual classroom. So we have some use cases, some examples. We'll also have time for Q&A to kind of dig into that a little bit further. And then finally, we are going to put things into practice and do an exercise with you all so you can get a sense of what we've done in the virtual classroom around, checking assumptions and getting buy-in. So a lot to cover in about 40 minutes, but we're excited to jump in.
Awesome. One other thing in addition to the agenda is the approach that we're going to use. Again, I kind of mentioned we'll step in and out of the actual presentation into why we're doing what we're doing in this style. But a piece of that is we want this to be an open dialogue the whole time. So we'll be jumping in on each other when we're talking. We would hope that you do the same. If there's a thought that sparks that you want to contribute, if you have a question, don't feel the need to hold questions until the end. This is being recorded, so I have the mic. We can only hear it on the recording with the mic, so I will either pass it to you or I will repeat your question. So if you see that happening, that's why that's happening. But we just want to make sure that this is, again, representative of our whole approach, which is trying to make sure that it's inclusive and that voices are being heard in the classroom. So with that, I'm going to give a little bit more detail to what Jessie provided on what our organization does, because it lends some of the reason why we're talking about what we're going to talk about today. And that's the fact that we do a lot of leadership development training work. So we're both learning designers. We design sessions, events, everything from face-to-face, in-person training events that take place over a couple of days, super short, somewhat low touch points with the learners, to long-term 6-month, year, 2-year-long learning programs that are done in a hybrid format, either virtual or a mix of virtual and in person. And much of our work is instructional, live instruction. So it's instructor-led training sessions. We do have asynchronous and other types of self-paced learning, but the majority of what we're going to be talking about today is that interpersonal relationship between instructor and facilitator and learner. And past that, the way that learning designers like ourselves can actually create that into the process of the design. So one of the things that we do at McChrystal Group is really try to drive that team performance through transformational leaders. We do leadership development training, obviously, but a piece of that is not just giving the content to the learners, but helping them adopt the mindset that creates an inclusive team. So taking it outside of the learning environment, what are you doing at your organizations to create an inclusive and learning environment for your teams? We want to manufacture and create that space in our training sessions, in whatever type of event that we are doing with the learners, so that they begin to practice those behaviors before they go back to their team so that they can integrate them in their everyday work. So that's a big part of how we approach what we do. Again, we do kind of all varieties of training modules and sessions, but much like we actually talked about, or Gabe was talking about this morning in his opening keynote about resilience when it comes to technology, we talk about resilience a lot when it comes to the individual and to teams. So being able to create that environment where you are adapting really quickly, you are navigating this complex environment that we're in, and that is similar for educators and designers who are trying to navigate this new technological environment, as well as obviously teams who are now operating in the same environment. So again, we'll kind of jump back and forth between specifically within the instructional space, how do you create this environment? And then what is the impact that using that environment in the learning space can have on the real world implications and the outcomes that people are using in their work life. So that's a big piece of what we do. And then finally, we do partner with senior advisors and facilitators from all walks of life who have a variety of experiences, military, public service, corporate, academic, kind of runs the gamut. But the important piece here is Jesse and I design the actual sessions, but often are not facilitating them. So a big piece of what we're doing is trying to make sure that we're embedding into the design the processes of inclusion. So creating those activities so that the facilitator who's actually going to do it, it's baked into their talk track and their design. So we try to adjust sometimes for the inclusive behaviors that may just in the moment fall short with the actual technology that can help to reinforce it. But then, of course, a big piece of what we do and what we talk about is transformational change is a combination of processes and behaviors. So while we embed the process into the design, we are also training our facilitators to be inclusive in their behaviors in the classroom. And we will give 2 case studies throughout the session, one of each.
So again, kind of going back to the leadership development approach at McChrystal Group. So we very much focus on resilient teams versus resilient individuals. Now, both are important, but if you think about a large scale company, an initiative, how do you get to success? How do you get to your intended outcomes? In most cases, it's because of your team. And so when we're thinking about training and development, we think about collective resilience and how we can prepare these communities to lead well and to meet their goals, whatever they are. And so we use this roadmap. It's inspired by Dr. Amy Edmondson, who's done a lot of research on teams and how working within a learning zone or a learning culture leads to shared ownership, accountability, psychological safety in the sense that you're willing to speak up as well as receive voice, whether it's an idea, a new idea, or pushing back on a popular decision. And so those are just some components that go into the learning zone. And so in that learning zone, you are admitting mistakes, you're taking ownership over what you're required to do, and you're working well with your team in order to continuously improve, continuous learn. I know lifelong learning probably resonates in this room quite well. Not always the case, that sometimes that's a new term or topic that we're trying to instill in the leaders that we work with and the clients that we support. And so it's interesting. So when you look at the apathy, so that's kind of like, a little apathetic, disinterested, as well as the comfort zone, you see that there's low levels of accountability and low levels of psychological safety. So mistakes might be made and they're not addressed and they're not being learned from. We also see clients who I would say are operating in that anxiety zone. So maybe there's a change undergoing, there's some stressors, some reorgs, some new vision, new leadership. And so they are fearful to speak up, to admit mistakes in fear of retaliation or repercussions. So we work with teams really all across this gamut. And again, it's really striving towards this learning zone because here we have some benefits when you're in the learning zone that you're willing to speak up, that you're willing to have productive conflict. We talk a lot about the tensions that sit on teams and really embracing those tensions in order to meet outcomes. Again, it's interesting in Dr. Amy Edmondson's work because she found that high performing teams actually reported more mistakes than other teams. And the truth wasn't that the other teams weren't making mistakes. They just weren't talking about them, owning up to them, using them as a learning opportunity. So again, this is what we're really striving for: accountability, emotional intelligence on teams, and the baseline of what we're approaching when we go into the virtual classroom.
Now, I want to add on to what Jessie said, because one of the reasons why this is important for us, obviously, is the team impact that it has. If your team doesn't feel safe speaking up, they're, one, not going to enjoy their work as much. They're not going to feel as engaged. They're not going to tell you about problems that are going on that need to be addressed. But for some of the reasons why we're here, this is equally important in the classroom. So this may not exist in certain higher ed environments, but specifically within the corporate world, you may be in an event or in a session with your boss or with your boss's boss's boss. And that type of dynamic can make it very scary to actually focus on the learning. Because if in order to learn, you need to share an example or help make it applicable, doing so could put you at risk if you don't trust that you're in a safe learning space because of the people that you're with or because of the dynamics that exist. So it's a nuance that exists within many environments, but specifically within this leadership development of corporate training. We want to make sure that people feel comfortable speaking up about all of the different challenges that may exist within their organization in order to improve. And the onus is on us to create that environment. So again, Gabe kind of mentioned that this morning, but if someone's not learning or not engaged or doesn't find it interesting, that's, of course, on the designer and the facilitator to create that experience. And so for us, it's really important not only to emphasize this mindset of how you approach your work life, but it's equally important. This is how our facilitators, our designers need to approach the work itself to start thinking about that inclusive environment. So the activity that we'll do later is something that we call weighted anonymous feedback. And it's a way to try to bypass hierarchy and groupthink because it allows everybody to submit their opinions anonymously virtually. And then we show that, and there's a way to vote or rank things in a way that is unencumbered by, I don't want to tell my boss that their idea is dumb. So again, we're trying to really reinforce every step of the way. How can you infuse it into the process, as well as how can you treat some of those behaviors in a way that will reinforce the inclusive nature. I'll take a second. Any initial thoughts, any questions, anything before we jump forward?
I guess I'm looking at the 4 zones here, and I was trying to think about what the apathy zone is, and I guess I'm thinking of it as, okay, like everyone is quiet, no one's saying anything because if they say something, something can go wrong. Is that kind of what that is, or how would you describe it?
I would say it's more about disinterest or disengagement in the process and the outcome and the change that is happening. And so it's interesting because when it's quiet, you might actually think that folks are disengaged, but they might be in the anxiety zone, right? Because they might be very nervous to speak up, or they could be in the comfort zone. I've seen this before. I feel good in my spot and I'm not going to really add more value to this discussion.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about the comfort zone is people are willing to speak up. So they'll say, "Oh, this isn't going well. I don't like this. I'm not interested in this topic." But then nothing happens. So there's no accountability for saying, "Okay, well then what do we do? What's the so what of this feedback that you're giving me?" And that's that piece where maybe mistakes are being voiced, but they're not being addressed. Whereas in the anxiety zone, no mistakes are being or voiced because you know that the accountability is going to be disproportionate to the mistake that was made. So you're going to be held accountable in a way that's not representative of what you actually did. So again, to get to that sweet spot of the learning zone, it has to be both trust that I can speak up and I won't be reprimanded or there won't be retribution for it, and there's going to be something that actually changes whatever is the problem in the future. So it's kind of the combination of those which allows people to move forward.
This is a great exercise to do with clients because it really brings out a lot of discussion and a lot of interesting insights. So to that end, I think we're actually going to go into some guiding principles for psychological safety.
Awesome. So what we've been talking about really comes down to these four points. So in order to have an inclusive design practice, it needs to be baked into the development of the delivery. And that goes to that process piece that we've talked about. It needs to not just be, okay, I plan to make sure that people feel comfortable asking questions, but it's, again, creating those environments where this is part of our process. I know that 2 slides in, I'm going to stop and ask if there are questions. That's baked into my talk track. Or I know that I'm going to have this activity where everyone's going to be asked to participate as opposed to just given the opportunity to participate. Things like that. Number 2 is that the learning technologies and tools can be leveraged to preview content and help learners prepare for a sensitive discussion or learning moment. So Jesse's going to give us a use case for this, but this really goes to the Peloton example that was used in Gabe's keynote this morning of being able to use asynchronous opportunities, whether it's an engagement tool, it's a survey, it's a video that they're watching, but something that prepares them for an instructor-led session later on so that they have that time to mentally think about what they want to bring to the table and how they want to show up, because obviously a big piece of what we're talking about is really sensitive topics. If I don't feel safe, if I don't feel heard, if I don't feel included, I'm not going to want to talk about that more if I'm in a space where I'm not ready to talk about that. But if I've had time and a little bit of preparation to say, okay, I know I'm going to be asked these hard questions, let me reflect on that, then I can come to the table ready to talk about it. And another big piece of this is learning modality. We want to be really respectful of the fact that obviously learners have different learning styles. So getting things in advance can help those folks who perhaps are more introverted or perhaps are visual learners and can actually retain the information in a different way before they're asked to participate in it. So that one for us is a really important supplement to some of the other type of instructional led work that we do. The third one is this flexibility in letting participants guide the conversation based on what is important to them. And I will give a use case for this and an example, but this is really about being prepared enough that you know what your learners need to get out in order for it to be a success in the traditional way of, okay, I hit these learning objectives and the participants got these takeaways from it. But most importantly, obviously, as we know, learning is a very personal, organic, authentic experience. And it's really important that as facilitators and instructors in the virtual space, we're giving as much care and attention to that authentic and organic nature of learning that happens as we do in the in-person spaces. And no one here will be surprised. Obviously, that's what many of us do, but having that real-time feedback is more difficult. So baking it into the process, whether it's we really ask everybody to be on camera or we ask everybody to complete some of these kind of elements before, it can just help reinforce that. And then it allows you to have that authentic conversation in the room. So certainly not earth-shattering by any means, pretty basic, but we'll talk about ways that this can come up specifically related to the psychological safety and inclusion, given the fact that when those conversations don't go according to plan, they can have some massive repercussions to the psychological safety that exists within the organization after the fact. And then finally, trust is a verb. So we talk a lot about trust at McChrystal Group. We talk about it as the combination of three specific things: competence, integrity or reliability, and benevolence. And what's most important about trust, in our opinion, is it's the perception of trust. So it actually doesn't matter if I think I'm trustworthy. It only matters if you think that I'm trustworthy. And your perception of my trustworthiness will depend on the way that I can demonstrate those three principles to you. So do you think I'm being nice to you? Do you think I have your best interest at heart? Benevolence. Do you think that I am competent? Have I demonstrated my competence to you? And then finally, do you think that I'm reliable? Do you think I'm going to do the things that I say I'm going to do when I'm going to do them? And can you trust that I'm going to do that consistently? So I give that framework because, one, it's a way to kind of dissect trust. So it's not this, amalgamous thing that just exists. It's something we can actually work on. It's a skill that we can improve. But more importantly, it's really, really important in an inclusive environment for your instructors and your facilitators to be able to demonstrate that trust and earn that really quickly, especially when you have such limited amount of time with learners. If you break that trust early on, you typically don't have enough time within the context of the learning environment on, a specific session to gain it back in the time that you need it in order for the learning to take place. Because if they've dismissed or you've broken trust with them, it's unlikely that the learning is going to happen. People will shut down, they'll disengage. So again, nothing necessarily earth-shattering, but we just think that it's really important, that trust aspect, as part of this conversation about creating an inclusive environment.
Great. So I think that building trust really plays a lot into this first case study example, a multimodal approach to creating psychological safety. So we were working with a client and we were training their middle managers, let's say. So these were individuals who had teams of contractors, junior employees. There had been a lot of change in the organization over the last few years, some outsourcing, some reorganization. So there was some tension and just fatigue, change fatigue, because you've seen things kind of happening over and over and you're being asked to mitigate and manage it. But there's a lot of emotions, a lot of stress, and a lot of toll taken out. So we did a session with this group about cultivating a climate of voicing up. So that was to empower them to voice up to their leaders about some of the challenges that they were facing and support that they needed, but also receiving voice. So how to kind of hear from their junior colleagues and their teams to really demonstrate listening and then hopefully a bias for action. So not just listening and then not taking action or ignoring or putting it aside. So we knew that this was a difficult discussion to have. And so what we did first is we provided, it was not asynchronous. It was within the context of the session. We did it right at the beginning of the session, but we had everyone fill out a 10-question questionnaire about inclusive practices. Everything from, do you have a trusted colleague that you can go to talk to during the day if you're facing challenges? Have you ever held back your voice or held back a question because you thought it was silly or that your leaders would think it was stupid? Also, would you feel comfortable pushing back on your leader's new strategy if you disagreed with it? So, these are difficult questions to answer, but they were, yes or no, true, false, 10 questions. We gave them a few minutes. And what we did is we visualized the data back to them. So in the aggregate, so we weren't singling anyone out or demonstrating, just overall trends. And what we found out right away is that this cohort of learners, they all felt very similarly. There was not a lot of difference between their thoughts. Most felt that they had a colleague they could go to, but a lot of folks held back their opinion or, didn't want to push back on a senior leader's new strategy or initiative. And so we were able to use that to really have the discussion in the room, and folks could come off mute and they could share their perspectives, knowing that there was safety there, that, folks agreed, they were aligned, in a way that we wouldn't have been able to do if we just started the conversation with a full discussion or put the prompts on the board and asked, folks to raise their hands. So that anonymity really helped the discussion. And then we had that data. So, in consulting, you have a requirement to the learners in the room. Their leaders also want to know what's going on. and they, genuinely want to support their teams, but like Nicole said, it requires trust. It's difficult for them to have those conversations and get honesty all the time. And so what was great is we were able to, again, provide that data back in the aggregate to show them this is what your middle managers feel. There's a lot of alignment here. Like, what actions can you all be taking to facilitate a dialogue, to address those issues? So, overall, we were able to kind of start that conversation asynchronously or with leveraging a learning technology. And then it enhanced the larger dialogue and then had a better outcome. So I really like that example because it kind of demonstrates the cycle in which we created it.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse. So this is the second use case, and this is much more about approach than it is about the process. So what Jesse really talked about was the process side of things, having that baked into the design, the anonymity, the ability to provide that information back in a way that can generate change, because you're actually saying, okay, here's what everybody said, here's the so what, here's what we would recommend you perhaps do differently. And in a way, it enables that real-time feedback, not just to the learners, but to the people who are responsible for those learners. So again, kind of jumping back between the responsibility, like Jesse said, that we have to the learners as designers and facilitators and stewards of learning, but we as an organization also have a responsibility to the people who have reached out to us to say, my organization needs help with this, and we need to do something to change. So ultimately, everything we're doing is about learning, but it's also about change. That's why people come to us. So that's a big piece of what we're talking about. So what I'm going to talk about is not going to be new to anybody. It's really about that flexibility piece that we talked about, but I'm going to talk about it in the context of the trust, because the example that I'm going to provide is we had a virtual session where it was an organization of scientists. This was 3 different labs who were geographically dispersed, who had all been acquired from different organizations, and were now coming together as one drug discovery organization under this pharmaceutical company. And the problem with that was they all brought their own leaders, and they all brought their own challenges and approaches to working together. And what we were brought in to do was to try to help them navigate a path forward to actually create some alignment and create some camaraderie among these individuals who felt very disparate and very, in many cases, unheard by their leaders. And so we had created this event where we were going to talk about team building, but we were also going to talk specifically about managing conflict. So I designed the session on managing conflict more productively, and it was really process and behavior focused again, but really looking at what are the sources of conflict. You have task conflict, you have status conflict, you have process conflict, you have person conflict. So what each of those means is slightly less important in this context. Happy to talk about that a little bit more after if you're interested in leadership theory. But the focus of this was we were really talking about what are the different sources of conflict, and then how can you actually address it. However, what was not in my design was a 30-minute discussion about the really challenging reality of individuals with privilege being able to speak up and manage that conflict with more confidence than those who are marginalized in the group. So what we ended up having in this conversation was a lot of people who had not been heard by their leadership then being able to come to our organization facilitators and voice with their superiors in the room, you may be able to manage this conflict in these ways, but there's a lot of risk to me in my position here if I do the same thing. And the recognition that this is their reality is something that, again, a very sensitive conversation that it would have been completely breaking trust if our facilitator, who was a white woman in this virtual classroom, had said, that's not what we're here to discuss. And so the ability to navigate that conversation with humility and vulnerability and be able to say, I don't know what your experience is, but let's talk about it more, so that everybody can walk away from this conversation feeling like they understand their colleagues better, feeling like they understand what some of those challenges and needs are, is really important to the learning environment. And so that's the context with which we talk about this. Again, it kind of sounds a little bit obvious in nature, but when you put it into practice and you're faced with this conversation as either a designer or a facilitator, being able to have the restraint to actually allow this conversation to continue despite the fact that you are very likely not going to get to the rest of the content in the session is really critical for folks to continue to trust you so that you can have that impact. So the reason why we talk about this is because within the virtual setting, it is harder to actually create some of those spaces. So doing things like what Jesse talked about of come prepared to talk about this, come ready to talk about this, and then in addition to that, setting it up at the very beginning of there's going to be some anonymous feedback that you're automatically going to hear can help frame it, and it can help give confidence to those individuals so that when it's actually time for the true speaking up, instructor-led portion of the event, they feel more confidence in voicing some of those concerns. But then again, from the trust side of the facilitator, being able to have the humility to navigate those conversations is driven by what the participants need. They will voice to you if they have that kind of basic prerequisite of what you're willing to talk about in the back of their minds. So as you move forward with designing and things like that, one of the things that we recommend is not only being flexible to allow that to happen, but then obviously being prepared with, okay, if everything goes sideways and the more important conversation that arises is not what we were planning to cover, what is still my responsibility to the learners at large that they take away from this? So being able to have that really succinctly prepared so that you're able to navigate a little bit more effectively is really important. So that's typically what we do. We also tend to send, follow-up information that has that. But one of the other pieces that we do is in this obviously very digital world, we will do recaps of everything that we've done, speaking of, the conversations that arose, and then add in the anonymous data to pull the themes together. So for the people who did decide to voice up, their voices are heard, but then we're also able to include the information of the folks who were less willing to speak up in the session itself. So that's one of the ways that we like to think about and approach inclusive design, is having that flexibility, being prepared on the back end. And one of the final ways that we're going to talk about this, we're actually going to demonstrate. This is the exercise that I mentioned earlier called weighted anonymous feedback. And this is something that we call a red teaming exercise. Red teaming is basically just a fancy word for the concept that everybody has biases and you can't really grade your own homework. So what are ways that you can proactively create processes that allow everybody's voice to be heard and allow you to identify and assess risk better based off of that diversity of perspective? So what we're going to ask everyone to do is think about this question. Take a second, think about it, and then we're actually going to take you through a process. We're going to ask you to submit your response.
We want you to go to slido.com. We have the code here, and you'll see the question. So on this next slide, you're going to click the Q&A tab. Identify where it says type your question. And then just we don't have a ton of time, take a minute and think, what is the hardest part about creating an inclusive environment virtually? Okay. Do not submit your response until instructed. Nicole, they can send. Yeah, so feel free to submit your response now. Now, as you scroll through, you should be able to see and read the ideas of your peers here in the room. And we're going to ask you to select the top 2 thought ideas by doing a little thumbs up. So I'm seeing creating content that will engage all types of learners. Feel that? Difficulty to read verbal cues or to read nonverbal cues or react to nonverbal cues. Okay. Including every possible accommodation prior to launching the experience, especially with technology. not being able to interact directly with all participants. That's great. So as you can see here, towards the top, I think we got some ideas that had, 3 or 4 thumbs up. But notice how, you don't know what each of you shared, and you were able to evaluate those ideas on their own. So not really thinking about, well, what's that person's title, or how much experience do they have in that role, or what interaction do they have with learners on the day-to-day. And so, as Nicole mentioned, it really helps kind of remove some of the bias and to focus on, the collective, or what the shared needs are, what the shared goals are, shared challenges. And so if you were to take action, you would know that, the top few really resonated most in the space. So I appreciate you all participating in this. So I was going to talk about measurement, but I actually want to pause and see if anyone has a reaction based on this activity, whether it's a question about it or a way that you might be able to incorporate it into your own practice. You say your question, I'll just kind of give an overarching. Yeah, so the question is about just incorporating this into the needs analysis process for a course, for a workshop, getting people's buy-ins and ideas in advance. I'm sure Nicole has some thoughts on this as well, but we utilize a lot of pre-event surveys and ask questions just like this to gather themes and touch points and knowledge that we want to then incorporate into the workshop or training. So I don't know if we've done this specifically in a pre-moment, but I do think it would work well, and definitely that style of what do we want to talk about, and as a team prioritize this accordingly.
Yeah, that actually was a great segue to our measurement discussion. So a big piece of why we measure, or how we measure learning, is by doing that piece beforehand, obviously getting the baseline. And sometimes what we end up designing is based on the specific, not only baseline, but then the needs. So what we'll do is we'll use that type of activity to get kind of unencumbered feedback on what they want to see, what they're struggling with, what their challenges are. But then we'll often also do a cohort of interviews. So we'll do things where they're not anonymous, but we're having that one-on-one interaction with learners or members of their team. Sometimes it's like a 360. So we'll have a training that we're going to be doing for, say, for example, mid-level managers, and we'll do interviews with their direct reports. So we'll say, what do you think your supervisor needs to work on? What do you think are areas of growth? How would you like to be treated differently, grown differently? What does that look like? So we'll do a combination of both the anonymous feedback from the individuals who are going to be in the cohort, as well as some one-on-one interviews with those individuals, as well as the people who are going to be impacted, ideally, by the learning that we're giving to the rest of the team. Any other questions? I know we have 1 minute left. Is that right? Okay. 1 minute left. Obviously, we'll be here after the fact if folks have other things that they want to talk about.
Yeah. So I know we didn't get a full chance to talk about engagement or metrics, but what the punchline of this is, all the work that we do, we have to measure impact. And some of it's about engagement. Do folks feel satisfied or pleased with the experience that they had? Were they stretched in the right ways, if you will? But then we really want to see knowledge retention, application, and then outcomes to the business based on the learnings. So we do incorporate all of that into our process. And yeah, just thank you so much for your time today and for participating in this process. And it was a pleasure to